Hello, my name is Dimitri Alexeyevich, and today is May 19th, in the year 2025, according to Kiev time. It is exactly 12 o'clock noon, and today we have a very special recording together with my good friend from Ukraine, to whom I now gladly and respectfully give the floor.
Hello, Dimitri Alexeyevich. This time I decided to say who I really am, so that it comes across as serious as an adult would. My name is Mikhail Sergeyevich, and I am originally from Odessa. I decided to show my real photographs here, the ones used in my Siemens passport, my international passport, and other documents, because I believe this is extremely important, and it's unacceptable to hide behind anonymity here, since otherwise people might not take it seriously. I would like to ask all viewers and listeners in advance, anyone who hears this broadcast, to translate this conversation into as many foreign languages as possible and to spread it on the internet as widely as you can. First and foremost, I ask that this message of mine be translated into English as well as into Ukrainian, Polish, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Hebrew, Persian, Turkish, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Greek, and if possible, into other languages. In recent years, and especially over the past month, I have been tormented by my conscience. I have dreams that urge me to record this message. I believe that there is a Christian ethic, a Christian duty to convey the truth to people as it is written in the Holy Scriptures. I take my example from people like Maria Kamenskaya, who is imprisoned today, from people like Valery Nikolaevich Parfenov, Yuri Ignatievich Mukin, Andrei Alexandrovich Tribunsky, Konstantin Otvetstveny, and Elena Lvovna Ruklina. I believe that this needs to be shouted from the rooftops, sounded in every bell, because each passing day brings the death of more and more people who are being deceived with propaganda on the level of Goebbels in 1941. I believe that people who have been deceived need to have their eyes opened, and that we should not be afraid at all, not afraid of any responsibility, and either win or perish or be thrown into prison. We must follow the path of Jesus Christ. We must not be afraid to speak the truth, because I believe that to do otherwise is simply a crime. After all, every day, souls are being stained and deceived, poisoned by the venom of modern Goebbels-style propaganda. I am tormented by the same dream over and over. I dream that I need to make an open appeal to real people of honor, that is, to those who understand what honor is, who live by God's principles. Command of the Almighty, that is, to the true aristocrats, the true people who live and understand what the concepts of good and evil are. That is, to people who are aware that there is the kingdom of heaven, that there is the last judgment of God. To people who understand that any person who stains their soul will end up in hell. I believe that people need to be saved because for 3 years now souls have been perishing, souls of people who are being corrupted by the current authorities. This is not the authority from the true God, not the authority of the Almighty, but the authority of the devil, the authority of the jester, Dionysus, the authority of liberal Satanism, that is, the authority of lies and deception. Today I have decided to address spiritual leaders, monarchs, true aristocrats, and sovereign heads of state. A free person, not circumcised in the flesh, but circumcised in the heart, as the New Testament teaches, a resident of Ukraine who assists Dimitri Alexeyevich, as well as helps the community for the truth about the crime of 9/11 and the 911 Zoology project. I want to address you in the name of the Lord God Almighty, who created one sky above all of us, above all nations, above all tribes. The Almighty stands above us all. He is the supreme judge. I believe that we are obliged to speak about this in the name of God, and not in the name of ourselves, mortal humans, because we are all servants of God. So I am a resident of Ukraine, Mikhail Sergeyevich, a man circumcised in heart, living in the covenant of the Almighty. In the name of the Almighty, I address all sovereign lords. I am tormented by pangs of conscience. I consider this address to be my duty of honor, because above all of us is the same sky, above all people is honor, above all aristocrats, above all free people, above all servants of God who live in the covenant of the Almighty. Please understand me correctly. I will not disclose this person's name, but a certain highly respected individual who, at least in my presence, has never broken the commandment "do not lie," told me in a private conversation that he had communicated with the leaders, that is, with the heads of the sovereign republics of the CS, and they told him that since 2006, or to be more precise, since the significant date of 2006-06-06, the president of the Russian Federation was replaced by puppet masters with some kind of Satanist who presents himself as Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, but who in reality is not him. In other words, the person who claims to be the president of the Russian Federation is not Putin Vivi at all. Obviously, and this is impossible for any observant person to deny, actors in silicone masks or lookalikes who physically resemble the late Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin are being used in the role of President Putin of the Russian Federation. And this is done in order to implant in the minds of the citizens of the Russian Federation the false idea that they are supposedly still being governed by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, whom they elected as president of the Russian Federation. I am convinced that the person playing the role of president of the Russian Federation is not Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I have carefully studied a variety of works by independent, honest bloggers and some public opinion leaders regarding the exposure of the substitution of the president of the Russian Federation, Putin, with his doubles or actors in silicone masks. I believe that this truth needs to be conveyed to the entire global community. In particular, because for any self-respecting head of a foreign state or other government official meeting with an impostor who is not the president of the Russian Federation, who is not the person he claims to be, is not only self-humiliation, but also a humiliation of the state that he leads or represents in negotiations. This is simply incompatible with the concept of honor for any aristocrat, for anyone who lives by the covenant of the Almighty, for any Christian, Muslim, Jew, in fact for any decent person who understands that one must not deceive others or break God's commandment, do not lie. It is especially important to understand this now, because this deception is leading to the mass deaths of deceived citizens of the Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine. A fake president who is waging an undeclared war in Ukraine is in fact forcing Russian citizens to commit premeditated murder as part of the so-called special operation, which formally is not considered a war. Let me remind you that it is only lawful to strike the enemy without violating the divine commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," exclusively during the period between the declaration of war and the conclusion of peace, and in no other circumstance. And that is precisely why all respectable heads of state have always declared war on each other before commencing actual hostilities. Because striking the enemy in a war that has not been declared is nothing more than ordinary premeditated murder, violating both the divine commandment "Thou shalt not kill" and the corresponding articles of the criminal code which condemn the perpetrator for murder. Try to realize that it is not the real Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin who gives Russian citizens the right to break the commandment "Thou shalt not kill" in the undeclared war in Ukraine, but rather some unknown puppet masters who put forward, instead of the president of the Russian Federation, one of the standby doubles or actors in silicone masks. But the saddest part is that neither these Putin doubles themselves, nor the actors in Putin masks, nor even more so, the unknown individuals behind any of these doubles and actors intend to bear any legal responsibility for the undeclared war in Ukraine. Try to understand that defeating the enemy in a war that has not been declared and is formally not considered a war, but rather a so-called special military operation, is in fact not only a violation of the article of the criminal code that punishes intentional murder, but also a violation of the divine commandment "Thou shalt not kill." In other words, the puppet masters behind Putin's doubles did not simply send their citizens to the slaughter so that they would die for the promised contract payments. It's much worse than that. They sent them there so that they would perish in the full biblical sense of the word perish. That is, so they would end up in eternal life in hell for violating the divine commandment "Thou shalt not kill."
Isn't this Satanism? But the most vile thing is that they unleashed an undeclared war on behalf of a non-existent person, that is, on behalf of the so-called Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who has not existed since 2006, and whose role is played by doubles or actors in silicone masks. And now I want to draw your attention to the work of some well-known bloggers and other opinion leaders who have made and continue to make efforts to expose the substitution of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin with doubles or actors in silicone masks who pretend to be the so-called president of the Russian Federation. Let me start with the well-known Viktor Ilyukin. The recording is very old. Here it is shown that Putin does not understand the German language, which I remind you, the real VV Putin speaks fluently. Putin's dog does not recognize him. The dog Connie. The dog Connie, why did Putin forget the German language? Many citizens and journalists have many questions about the constantly changing appearance of our president Putin. If you ever get the idea to compare Putin's appearance and voice at the beginning of his rule and now, you will be amazed by the obvious difference.
Дорогие друзья,
Сегодня, в новогоднюю ночь,
мы с вами на пороге нового
я, как и вы, с родными и друзьями
2014 года.
собирался выслушать слова приветствия президента России.
Французского сопротивления. Никогда не забудем тех, кто огромное количество наших граждан. Президент Олланд был настолько любезен, что пригласил меня как представителя России на эти торжественные мероприятия. Что это всегда помогает при принятии каких-то прагматических, я бы сказал, даже технократических решений в сфере экономики. Трагические, печальные и в то же время торжественные. Я с удовольствием принимаю это приглашение и благодарен президенту.
Moreover, if you carefully examine photographs and videos of the president throughout his entire political career, you can count not just one, but up to 6 doubles. Notice how, in photos from different years, Putin's forehead wrinkles are different. For one person, the pattern of forehead wrinkles does not change over time. But here, we see sometimes a straight check mark, sometimes waves. Such differences cannot be explained by age-related changes, even if we assume that the original underwent plastic surgery to maintain a youthful appearance. The wrinkles around the eyes have different shapes, sometimes a deep triangle reaching to the middle of the cheek, other times an almost gentle arc. There are also diagonal wrinkle lines that sometimes appear and sometimes are absent, different manners in the same hand gesture, and different earlobes.
A letter from one of Putin's former colleagues has appeared on the internet. He writes that at the beginning of his presidency, Putin recognized his friends. They even went skiing together in Austria during one of his visits. Since 2006, Putin stopped recognizing him. The colleague suggested that the reason might be Putin's death from spinal cancer and his subsequent replacement by a double. In 2005, Russian doctors discovered that Putin had spinal cancer, and he was sent to Germany for examination and treatment. German doctors confirmed the diagnosis. According to one of them, Putin only had a few months left to live. They refused treatment. Putin was taken back to Russia. How surprised this doctor was when, about 6 months later, he saw him on TV looking cheerful and healthy. A colleague also knows that Putin's double speaks German like someone who has learned it very well. Vladimir himself spoke German with an East German accent. According to published biographical data, Putin, a professional intelligence officer, lived in Germany for 5 years. At the beginning of his presidential term, he spoke German excellently, using complex constructions.
Aber abgesehen von der objektiven Problemen und manchmal aufrichtig, ganz ehrlich gesagt von eigener Ungewandtheit, schlägt unter allem das starke, lebendige Herz Russlands.
Year 1007, Putin makes serious grammatical mistakes in his speech. On German channels, the mistakes are edited out, but on Russian ones they are not.
Sie haben gemacht, geben Sie mir Zeit, das zu beantworten. Sie haben gemacht, was Sie gemacht wollten. Jetzt lassen Sie uns in Ruhe, geben Sie mir Zeit, das zu beantworten.
The year 2012. Putin speaks in sentences from about the 5th grade curriculum of a general education school. And his pronunciation leaves much to be desired.
Dort rechts ist Kreml. Ja. Kreml und das ist Honig.
April 2013. Putin cannot do without a translator.
Lebendige Herz Russlands.
An interview with a German television company. The whole speech is clearly being translated for him. Pay attention. Putin only responds after he has heard the translation.
Da soll eingeschüchtert werden. Warum handeln Ihre Behörden so?
Ich glaube, Sie schüchtern die deutsche Öffentlichkeit ein. Es passiert doch gar nichts Ähnliches und man muss die Menschen nicht einschüchtern, man muss objektiv die Entwicklungen beleuchten. Und was ist denn die objektive Beleuchtung? Ende vergangen.
Putin puts his headphones back on. In our understanding, this works. In February 2014, the media showed a story about a meeting between Putin and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The Prime Minister petted Putin's dog, and the Russian president warned that she was prone to biting. Kenyan experts noticed the dog's strange behavior. According to them, dogs do not behave like that in the presence of their owner. The conclusion: either it's not the same dog or it's not the real Putin. Who selects and trains the doubles? Obviously, this is a hallmark of secret intelligence services. The logical conclusion is that political decisions in our country are still being made by the same Western masters behind the Yeltsin coup and, apparently, today's Russian authorities. Now, the authorities are engaged in identifying every citizen. However, it is important for every citizen to consider the identification of the president. This question has always been important, both in history and in politics. For example, when an heir to the English throne is born, the Home Secretary is always present to ensure the baby is not switched. And only in recent years has everything been done to prevent the identification of rulers. For instance, Kate Middleton, the wife of British Prince William, was the first in history to give birth without the presence of the minister. In Russia, the only ones who turned the question of Putin's doubles from gossip into an official inquiry were the Will Party. The response from the Prosecutor General's office was shocking. A change in the president's appearance does not violate your civil rights. We know nothing about Putin's family. Allegedly, this is also for security reasons. But in no other country in the world do presidents hide their children or their wife. On the contrary, they are always in the public eye, and for voters, it matters what kind of family the current president has. But if Putin has been replaced, it becomes clear why we don't see his family. Apparently, his children and his wife, who is now his, simply don't want to live with a stranger, a double of their father and husband. Besides, they might accidentally reveal this secret, so it's better to keep them away.
In this regard, I recommend paying attention to the works of Yuri Ignatievich Mukhin. The most illustrative, and in my opinion the most compelling of all Yuri Ignatievich Mukhin's arguments is this particular episode he highlighted. Here, Putin's stand-in, acting as the president of the Russian Federation, meets with African guests, and while reading from a piece of paper, mistakenly pronounces the surname of the renowned political and state figure, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, as Lumumba using Lu instead of M.
В России помнят и чтят память выдающихся сынов Африки. Назову имена Патриса Лумумбы.
The fact is, the real Putin would never have made such a ridiculous mistake under any circumstances. After all, the name and surname of Patrice Lumumba were well known to every Soviet person, and especially to every Soviet person of the real Putin's generation. Not to mention that since the early 1960s, a major world-renowned university in Moscow, the People's Friendship University, has been named after Patrice Lumumba. So the real Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin could never have mistakenly read Lumumba instead of the correct Lumumba from a script. To make such a blunder,
I will name Patrice Lumumba.
Only his double could have made such a mistake, someone who was obviously younger and simply hadn't lived through the time when Patrice Lumumba was frequently mentioned in Soviet newspapers, on the radio and on television. This episode is the most compelling evidence that the president of the Russian Federation is not Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, but someone else. Now I want to show you an article from the Sun newspaper. I hope that Dimitri Alexeyevich will add these clips and other materials I mentioned to our video. If you say otherwise, or as you might imagine, if you say something contrary to what has been stated in this context, it's very difficult. It says here that a Japanese neural network determined that in 2023 there were 3 different Putins, one at the Victory Parade, another in Mariupol, and so on. They do not match when compared automatically. The ruthless and impartial artificial intelligence claims that these are 3 different Putins. Even visually, Putin's face looks different in all 3 cases.
So who is some lousy Solovyov compared to them? And Anatoly Shary, who is supposedly a completely independent blogger, didn't fall behind Nesmeyana either. Idiotic rumors about Putin's death could be spread by Russian special services in order to demonstrate the stupidity of the press, which swallows these idiotic rumors for the 100th time. Anatoly didn't realize that if we're talking about the stupidity of the press, in this case, Shary himself topped the list of that stupid press. over such a trivial matter from some internet fool. But look, 2 days before Solovyov, already on October 24th, out of the blue, Peskov started crowing about Putin's doubles. Rumors that Putin had heart problems over the weekend are groundless. He is perfectly fine. This is yet another hoax. The claim that the president has doubles falls into the category of absurd hoaxes. There are no doubles, and this does nothing but make us smile. End of quote. As you can see, it was the Kremlin that first started denying some rumors about doubles, and only after that, 2 days later, Solovey popped up so that everyone would think he was the one who started these rumors. But if it wasn't Solovey, then who actually started the conversation about Putin's doubles? In fact, on October 20th, the Japanese TV company TBS News compared 3 contemporary Putins using artificial intelligence and concluded that Putin has 2 doubles. Photos of the real Putin with contemporary Japanese performers were not compared so as not to compromise the Japanese authorities. Instead, only photos of the 3, essentially actors playing the role of Putin, were used. Moreover, out of these 3 actors, the Japanese identified as the real Putin, the one who took part in the parade on the Tribune on May 9th. As if any actor couldn't stand on the Tribune and deliver a speech. I repeat, the Japanese did not dare to compare photos of these 3 actors with photos of the real Putin. Here is a brief excerpt from that program.
First, let's compare the voice of Putin, who visited a helicopter factory in eastern Siberia in March of this year. Later, he was damaged by the site.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What is the actual difference between these 2 fragments, exactly?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for...
Voice specialist Mitsutoshi Muraoka. Here you can see that the first letter S stands out strongly. The sound Pa reaches a value of 9 kHz, and the sound C reaches a value of 5.4 kHz. Horses in a sieve. I think horses are some kind of exactly Kuriga Yunting Kuragetsina. Let's compare it with this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here the letter C in the word thank you sounds very weak, and this means that doctors understand that doctors are very weak. Besides the difference in the pronunciation of the S sound, there is also a difference in the pronunciation of the Pa and C sounds. Let's listen one more time. A big difference.
The wheels on this type, my miracle whales, are passing by. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's necessary to take into account the differences in recording conditions as well as in pronunciation itself, but still such differences are extremely rare. I think that's not very many. At this point we can say that the probability that these voices belong to different people is very high. We consider the real Putin to be the one shown in the top photograph, taken on May 9th at the Victory Parade. We compare the other 2 images using artificial intelligence. The similarity to the face that visited the Crimean Bridge is 53%, which is a low indicator. Facial recognition specialists would in most cases say that there is no match. From this, it can be assumed that this might be a double. And here as well, the other photograph has a similarity of 40%, which is even lower, meaning it is likely another double. Moreover, the similarity between these 2 photographs is 18%, which indicates that these are 2 different people. But when they don't provide an alibi, leaving the face in the shadows, someone is at a loss, just like in a mime. Expert analysis by artificial intelligence facial recognition clearly shows a high probability of there being at least 2 doubles. I think it's good that you have become more confident. Putin's gait, as seen at the naval parade, matched by 86%. Of course, that seems sufficient, but for artificial intelligence, these numbers indicate the presence of another person. I determined that this is not the case. Here are the results of the video analysis of Putin's visit to Mariupol. In September, Putin visited Mariupol. The percentage of matches dropped to 75%, which increases the likelihood of a double. 75%. This conclusion was drawn based on the study of body posture while walking.
Nowadays, computer programs around the world identify citizens by their faces even during financial transactions. In other words, based on the faces of these 3 performers, they wouldn't even be able to collect Putin's pension. And our homegrown opposition idiots all grumble in unison, Putin, Putin. There are no words for this that aren't obscene. So this Solovey, by pretending to be an idiot, shielded all the chatterboxes, including the opposition, from having to discuss the conclusions of the Japanese artificial intelligence. Solovey, so to speak, threw himself on the grenade of the only information that the people of Russia and Ukraine actually need. That's what he's needed for.
Then I found the article The Vault, which has been thoroughly scrubbed from the internet. Lyudmila Putina does not recognize her husband. She says, "I just don't recognize Putin anymore. Where did Putin go, I wonder?" Perhaps I should remind you that in the scandalous interview with the German magazine Der Spiegel, when she was asked why she divorced her husband, Lyudmila Putina replied with something along the lines of, "This man is not the one who was my husband." I would like to conclude my address with the following words. I am addressing, first and foremost, the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Oleksandrovich Zelensky, the President of the Republic of Belarus, Alexander Grigorievich Lukashenko, the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, the President of the Republic of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as well as all other heads of sovereign states, and separately crowned heads, and also to His Holiness, the Vicar of Christ, the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, the Great Pontiff. Please be aware that when you communicate by phone, correspond, or even meet in person with the President of the Russian Federation, you are not dealing with the real Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who has long been dead, but with a criminal impostor, illegally occupying the office of President of the Russian Federation, pretending to be VV Putin, which he in fact is not. Furthermore, please take into account that by communicating with a criminal impersonating VV Putin, you are not only degrading your own personal dignity and the dignity of the sovereign state you lead and represent in negotiations, but you are also producing international treaties and other important documents that have no legal force whatsoever, since such documents will always bear the knowingly forged signature of VV Putin, which without any doubt has been signed by the impostor, the criminal impersonating VV Putin. Therefore, such documents can be declared illegal at any moment by the new authorities of the Russian Federation and thus have no validity whatsoever. I would also like to remind you that in the hands of the criminal impersonating Vladimir Putin, not only is the formal supreme power in the Russian Federation, but also Russia's nuclear weapons, which, at the whim of this criminal or his puppeteers, could be used, including for the destruction of your countries. And finally, I want to remind you that the invasion of the sovereign territory of Ukraine by the armed forces of the Russian Federation without a declaration of war, which has so far been called by the vague term so-called special military operation, was also carried out on the orders of the person impersonating Vladimir Putin, who in fact is not Vladimir Putin. Therefore, if every self-respecting head of a sovereign state, starting with the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Oleksandrovich Zelensky, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and including the presidents of all other sovereign states interested in ending the bloodshed in Ukraine, honestly announces publicly that the Russian Federation is being run by criminals who for many years have been putting forward an impostor instead of the late Vladimir Putin, Ian, his doubles and lecturers in silicone masks, then the armed invasion of Russian troops into Ukraine will cease on its own due to the absence of a supreme commander-in-chief of these forces. However, the refusal of elected heads of sovereign states and noble-crowned individuals to publicly declare that the Russian Federation is being run by doubles and actors in silicone masks and not at all by President Putin V of the Russian Federation, V, will only mean that all these heads of sovereign states and even the noble-crowned individuals are not just lying to their people, but are also acting in concert with the puppet masters behind Putin V's doubles. V and are the true organizers and direct culprits of the unprecedented bloodshed that they have jointly unleashed in Ukraine and have no intention of stopping. With that, I say goodbye and once again ask you to translate my message into all languages and spread it as widely as possible. This same address of mine will also be published in text form. Thank you for your attention and for your support.
Well then, thank you very much for providing such a clear and precise definition, as well as for delivering such an understandable and well-articulated address. I sincerely hope that our listeners and audience members will support us wholeheartedly and help to give this important material the widest possible publicity and circulation, ensuring it reaches as many people as possible. Additionally, I hope they will also assist us in translating it into various foreign languages so that people from different countries and backgrounds can benefit from this valuable information. With that, I say goodbye to you and wish everyone success. And above all, I wish for a swift end to this unprecedented bloodshed in Ukraine for each and every one of us. Thank you, goodbye, and all the best.